This lesson we want to talk about finding the shadow pattern in your painting and then keeping it. Make sure that throughout the painting you don't lose it by getting too many different value changes within the shadow pattern. The shadow pattern is what holds the composition together. And we can also change the shadow pattern, make it bigger, smaller, push it or pull at different areas to change the composition. So it's kind of the key to everything compositionally and to make your painting hold up at the end. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about finding the right shape in your shadows. And we're thinking in terms of finding the right shape because the photograph gives us a place to start to think about for the design of the shadow, which is the biggest part of the design of the whole composition, is the shadows. So what I do with the shadows is the most important thing as far as the composition goes. And this group of photographs here is in one spot. It's a desert garden, a lot of buildings in there as well. A great place to paint and take photographs. And all the photographs are either early morning or late afternoon. There's no midday photographs because everything goes flat midday. Not that you can't paint on the midday or have a good composition or have a good painting, but it is harder to find a good composition when you're painting mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon. It's early morning, late afternoon where the light's low, shadows are long, and you can do something with those shadows. You can kind of recompose and create better shapes out of them. And that's what this exercise is geared towards, is finding the big shapes of the shadows and then how can I change them to make them work better. The more you do that, the more you develop an eye for that. So it just like everything else, it takes exercise. And I'll do this sometimes only with the thumbnail drawings, small little 3 by 5 inch graphite or carbon pencil drawing, something dark, where I can just work with the shape, do 2 or 3 or 4 for each composition and come up with a little bit better shape. That way you're thinking outside the box and not just copying the photograph. Now this particular one here, again, you see pretty definite shadows in here. These shadows falling this way and this way on the building, and then the definite shapes of the shadows in the trees. But I want to be able to push it a bit more. Create like the shadow here in the tree. Make it a little bit different so it gives more shape to the tree or more sense of light hitting the tree. And what I mean by that is, and I'll show the shadow pattern first, before I did the shadow pattern, I made some changes in the composition. And down here in this area, it's too much of this plant with the kind of violet flowers. And it's all kind of going along at the same height, and the shadow gets kind of cut off there. So what I did was change it a little bit. I made the shadow here more varied instead of straight across. I'm going more varied like that. That's always more interesting. So when I have something that's straight across, I will change it and then change the shape of the shadow as well. Here you can't see the shadow over here, but it's just too straight. So changing it as a shadow from these, green plants here and the plant up here, it just makes it easier to make it more interesting, these shapes. Anyway, more varied, not straight. Then the shadow pattern, which is what we're really after here, is this. And I can create a shape in here. I want to be very careful with these shapes in the sense that it's really going to make, in this case, the tree here a lot more interesting if I can find the shape of the shadow pattern. You can see it really makes the tree stand out. And I'm overemphasizing it, which I tend to do, because again, it creates better shape. And I'm trying not to get small and picky, even though some of it is, but I want an interesting shape in there. To me, that works better than that. You can see the shadow pattern here pretty definitely right in this area. But when I overemphasize it, it creates more shape on the tree. And same thing back in here. And you can see if I emphasize the shadow on the building, shadow on the porch, I'm creating more contrast as well. And that gives me more sense of light. But it's real important in the trees and important in the overall pattern because it sets up the design for the whole painting. It flows this way and up underneath the porch into the trees and kind of winds back again. So I want a pattern that flows throughout the whole painting and just creates a better composition. And that usually means just tweaking it a little bit, making something a little bigger as far as the shadow pattern goes, longer, make it connect to the next shape maybe a bit more. The next photograph, just like the last, there's some things here I want to change before I do the shadow pattern. So what I don't like is this tree coming from way out in the bottom, just poking its head into the picture plane and just coming in front of my focal point. And it's not that big a deal to eliminate this tree. Then I want to add some trees in the background because it needs some kind of dark back in here to make this house pop out. I don't want a light sky against a light house. There's just no contrast there. So I could have shapes of dark in there as well. So first thing I do is get rid of that tree. And I can play around with the shape of this bush here, kind of vine on the house, made it a bit more interesting. Bush here, I just wanted more interest, and I want a shape that shows just a bit more interest, and emphasizing the color. I really didn't see the color of any florals on there, but I can add it there because we can do whatever we want, or the artist. And a little bit of dark back in here to create some contrast against the sky, a little bit more. I did have to create I had to create a value change in the shadow here in the house. So doing that, just getting 2 or 3 values. In this case, some kind of complementary color scheme, yellow and violet or blue and orange, and it just gradually gets darker. But all of these values in the shadow here are darker than anything in the light. As long as I keep that contrast, that'll work. But here's the shadow pattern. So again, using that shadow pattern to shape up the tree a bit more, I could create a bit more interesting edges on that shadow pattern. But that, when I emphasize that shadow, it really makes that tree have more shape. Whereas if I don't have it, still shape there, but I've simplified it and emphasized it a bit more. And then have that shadow pattern come down on the sidewalk here and creating a shape of light and dark that creates more interest. But getting rid of that tree in front, I think, really helps a lot. So don't hesitate to make changes. I don't make changes where I'm totally making up the whole composition unless it's an exercise in just painting from memory or practicing to see what you know as far as creating your own composition. But I generally get more inspiration from seeing something and then try and think outside the box to come up with a better composition. Emphasize the shadow pattern more. Again, it just makes more solidity and creates more interest. The same area again, early in the morning here, and I don't care for this bench here. It doesn't do anything to the composition. It, again, just kind of pokes its head in. So I would eliminate that and create more of a pattern of shadow on the sidewalk from trees that are outside of the picture plane. So I want to create more interest there and really emphasize the shadow pattern here. Pushing that a little darker, creating better shapes. I want these dark patterns on the trees to really make the trees stand up, make it a vertical plane. If I don't get these dark enough, they won't be a vertical plane. Also, getting them dark enough creates more contrast. And varying the shape or creating a shape that's more interesting gives the tree more shape. A lot of times in the photograph, the darks, like here, there's a lot of little lights and darks, and so you can lose the shadow pattern fairly easily. So emphasize it more and keep it that way in your painting. Now I might add a few lighter values in here or lighter darks, but I don't want to lose that strong contrast that I have going here. I can break it up a bit more, but I want to keep that pattern going. This is another one here where it's a bit more complicated because of the florals here in front. Just real busy, a lot of long shadows coming in from the right. So I want to simplify this before I start painting. Same thing with these bushes here. You don't really see that sharp-edged difference between the dark and the light. Here you do. Up here you see it pretty strong, the dark and light, and on the building you do, but in these bushes you don't. And it's too easy to get them mushy, and they don't have any solidity or weight to them. So spend a lot of time getting more of a definite pattern. So I'm creating a shape and a pattern in here. It's kind of easy to follow down below. Getting rid of a lot of the little lights and variations of dark and just a simple dark and light pattern. And if I keep that pattern, even though I might add different colors, some different values in the shadow and light, it's going to be strong because I keep that pattern. I don't let it become like this, where too many little darks and lights make it lost. But this is a lot easier to paint, if I can get that first. Same thing with the shrubbery here, creating patterns in the dark that make it easier to see. And again, when I can emphasize them more and create a little bit different shape, I can create more shape in the tree or the bush. Because again, we're working with a flat surface. If I can overemphasize the shape, it's going to work a lot better. This last one here I didn't do anything with. The shadow pattern's kind of evident, but this is the area that needs to be simplified. Maybe getting rid of a third of the chairs. But I like the design. The wall here leading you back into the background. The shadow patterns here pretty strong sunlight. Again, you get that strong light early morning, late afternoon. When you're taking references, photos, or painting outside, that's the best time to do. Not that you can't paint midday. You can and you should, but it's harder to come up with compositions and find images that are more exciting or paintable. That's what we're going to do, is really emphasizing the shadow pattern. And then when we paint, we want to keep it. We don't want to lose it when we start adding some detail and variation of color.